With the help of Hashem, we are learning Sukah Daf Mem Gimel. We're going to start on Daf Mem Gimel, 2 lines from the top of the Amid. We introduced at the end of the shiur yesterday what's known as Gezeira de Rabbah, the decree that Rabbah spoke out, explaining as to why when Shabbos falls out on Sukkot, even on the first day, why is it that nowadays, as we'll be learning, we do not take the Lulav? And again, just to review, that during the times of the Beis HaMikdash, yes, we also were following what we call this decree of Rabbah, that if Shabbos fell on any of the 6 days of Sukkot, the Lulav was not taken. It was not taken, not even in the temple. But Bezman Beis HaMikdash Haya Kayam, as we will conclude this entire sugya today, in the Beis HaMikdash, on the first day, the Lulav was taken. But other than that, even though the Torah says, let's say in the Beis HaMikdash, 7 days, v'samachtem lefnei Hashem Elokeichem, for 7 days, and we know that this refers to taking of the Lulav. But because of Gezeira, because of, as Rabbah explained, there was a fear that people might end up wanting to know better how to take the Lulav, and they're going to go to the bucket, to the expert, either like Rashi says, to find out how to do the na'anuyim, how to shake it, or to find out exactly how and when is the bracha made. They might end up inadvertently carrying it, and even to appreciate more, even though they might end up carrying it the way we just learned the opinion of Rebbe Yossi, that B'dvar Mitzvah, you won't even be Chai V'chatos. Still, we do not, because of Arvus, to prevent another Jew from inadvertently breaking the Shabbos. The Lulav is not taken, so we're going to continue learning more pratim about when do we apply his Gezeira, when do we not apply his Gezeira, and we will be learning that the source that Lulav min HaTorah must be taken on the first day, even outside the temple complex, even what we call in the Gvulin, even in the provinces, that means outside the Beis HaMikdash. We're going to see how Lulav is, the mitzvah of Lulav is only during the daytime of the day, in contrast to the mitzvah of dwelling in the Sukkah. Dwelling means both by day and by night. And on Daf Mem Gimel Amid Beis, we're going to start focusing on the mitzvah that was mentioned in the mitzvah about Arava. Now, Arava really means that in the Beis HaMikdash, min HaTorah, as we will see today, you had very tall, what we called Aravos that were taken. And actually, we're going to discuss on Mem Gimel Amid Beis, was the mitzvah to do netila, for the Kehanim to hold it, that's the meaning of netila, or was the mitzvah for these Aravos simply to be laid and leaned on the Mizbeach, that's called Zekifa, or actually standing it around the Mizbeach. Now the Kohanim would circle around the Mizbeach, but we'll see that's the whole question, whether they would circle around the Mizbeach with the Dalad Minim, or would they hold that uniquely tall Arava and circle the Mizbeach with it. That's Netila versus Zekifa. And ultimately we're going to come to the conclusion that even though theoretically the Gezeira de Rabbah should not have applied on the first day of Sukkot, if Shabbos falls on the first day of Sukkot in Eretz Yisrael, but since his decree does apply in Babel, and we don't want to make, for the Yidden that live in Babylonia and the Yidden that live in Eretz Yisrael, for them to have complete different ways of practicing Yiddishkeit, that's included in the prohibition of loises goidedu, as we'll speak out, so everyone is on the same page. And nowadays, because of Gezeira de Rabbah, even if Shabbos falls on the first day of Sukkot, even in Eretz Yisrael, the Lulav will not be taken, and much, much more. Let us start on Daf Mem Gimel Amud Aleph, towards the end of the second line from the top of the Amid. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam sha'ar kol nehim b'dvarim. Okay, so we introduced this fear that if the mitzvah of Lulav will be done, someone inadvertently might end up carrying the Lulav, violating the Isur of transferring an item 4 cubits or more in the public domain. So asks the Gemara, if we have such a concern and that justifies the rabbinate to decree not to do the mitzvah, yesh koyach b'yad chachamim la'akar davar ben ha'torah b'sheva al taisa, so yom rishon nami, they should have also abolished the mitzvah of taking the lulav in the Beis HaMikdash when Shabbos falls out on the first day of Sukkot, and we know that it does not happen that way, that in the Beis HaMikdash, when the first day of Sukkot is on Shabbos, they did take the Lulav. Here also someone might come to carry it. So answers the Gemara, I'll tell you why there was no fear, because as we learned in the end of the Mishnah, that the Chachamim made a takana, that Yidden should only take the Lulav in their homes. Let's read it inside. Now they did it because of the types of danger that came about by people fighting over getting deer or any set of the 4 species. But hold on, how does that help? If a person doesn't know how to make a bracha, they might go to the knowledgeable one, they might go to the chacham. So the point is that when you are told you have to take the lulav in your home, that will remind you, that will aid your memory, it may not be carried. But you have to take it at home. B'chlal, people know that at Shabbos you're not allowed to carry. People might forget because they are busy doing the mitzvah. This will serve as a reminder. So the Gemara's problem is that hot tinach, that's good. Achar takana. Indeed, after they made the decree, now it makes sense why there is a lesser of a fear. But koidem takana, but listen, it wasn't always that way. There was for many, many years that people would shake the mitzvah, they would shake the lulav, they would wave the lulav in the Beis HaMikdash. So such a reminder did not exist. Ma'ika l'meimar. So here comes a very important point. In other words, Gezerah Darabah is one part of the equation, this fear that people might end up carrying. But it's counterbalanced and it has to be weighed, and every case is a case. So it has to do with sometimes how important is the mitzvah. I'll give you a great example. In Megillah, Tosfos asks, Gezerah Darabah, why didn't the Chachamim say that if the 8th day falls out on Shabbos, a bris should not be done? How about that? And there's many answers to this question. One answer is that bris is such an important mitzvah that there were so many covenants that were made regarding the bris milah that it overweighs the fear and the gzeira of Rabbah. In other words, yes, we have the concept of we want to prevent people from carrying inadvertently, but there has to be weighed against what? Or when we spoke out yesterday at the end that Al Pi Chasidus, the mitzvahs that accomplish things that even Shabbos cannot accomplish, like for example eating matzah, doing the Seder, then the Chachamim did not enact the Gezerah Darabah. So says the Gemara Ella, Rishon, taking the lulav on the first day, that is considered the greatest mitzvah. Where do we see it's considered the greatest mitzvah? The Isei Min HaTorah B'Gvulen, by the fact that even outside the temple, everyone is obligated biblically to take the lulav, even though that in the temple, all 7 days are equal. Doesn't matter. The fact that on the first day, you're chayiv to take the lulav in the temple and outside of the temple, that is an indication that there's something unique about the first day. So it's, so to say, a greater mitzvah. So therefore, like Gazru Buhu Rabbanan, they needed to weigh. Lulav became more important, and it overrides this fear that someone might end up carrying the lulav. Hanach meaning, but regarding any of the other 6 days, since the leis nehu min HaTorah b'gvulen, since outside the Beis HaMikdash to begin with there isn't a biblical obligation, even though in the temple there is, but again, only in the temple. That's an indication that it's, so to say, relatively a lesser of a mitzvah. So therefore, Gazru Buhu Rabbanan. So what we added, a very important nuance today, that this Gezerah Darabah is never set across the board. You have to weigh it against its counter. It has to be counterweighed. Okay. Iyachi, 1 second, asks the Gemara, now that you told me that there's something unique about the first day, the fact that biblically lulav has to be taken everywhere. We're not going to, the Chachamim did not go ahead and tell people don't do it. So ha'idna nami, nowadays, why don't we nowadays tell people that if Shabbos falls out on the first day of Sukkot, even though there isn't yet a temple, people should still be obligated to take the lulav, but we know that's not the case. So answers the Gemara, Anan, we that live in Bavel, since lo yadi'inon bikviyusa diyarcha, since we're not certain when Rosh Chodesh was, therefore we're not certain when the 15th day of the month is, therefore outside Eretz Yisrael, we keep 2 days Yontiv. So since there is a doubt, what's the reason Gezerah Darabah will not be said? Because the first day, how do you know it's the first day? Now guys, you have to appreciate that there's the other side to it. If it's not Yom Tiv, then there's no problem carrying either. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. In other words, there is the concept of Gzeira D'Rabba. It's only going to be overweighed. The first day is the fact that you have to do it everywhere. You don't even know if it's the first day. So it weakens. It weakens the mitzvah, so Gzeira D'Rabba stands. So the Gemara says, well, that only explains why we in Bavel don't do the mitzvah if Shabbos is on the first day. But inu diyadi b'kviyusa diyarcha litchu, but they, meaning the Yidden that live in Eretz Yisrael, even after Churban Abayis, which means nowadays, even prior to the building of the temple, why don't they take the Lulav when Shabbos falls out on the first day of Sukkot, as it was in the temple? And the Gemara now, we're going to change this at the end of today's shiur. We're going to change this on top of Mem Dalet. The Gemara says, Ein Chanami. Yeah. People in Eretz Yisrael, even after the Churban Abayis, will do the mitzvah of Lulav if Shabbos falls out on the first day. Wow. And I'll prove it to you. How will I prove it to you? So we're going to go with the version of the Tanan. The Tanan Chada, in one Mishnah it says, happens to be our Mishnah, B'yom Tov Rishon Shel Chag Shchaliyas B'Shabbos Kol Ha'omer Lichenes Lulaveim Lahar Habayis. Our Mishnah clearly speaks about how everyone took the Lulav on Temple Mount. Now this is when the temple was standing, obviously. That's why they took it to Temple Mount, Erev Shabbos Sukkos. However, but V'Tanan Idach, but there is another Mishnah that we already learned on 41b, Amem Aleph Amid Beis, that people would bring their lulavim to the Beis HaKnesses. Why would they bring it to the Beis HaKnesses? Because even after the temple was destroyed in Eretz Yisrael, they would take the lulav if Shabbos is on the first day. Shma Mina, Kam Bez Beis HaMikdash Kayim, they brought it to Har HaBayis. Kam Bez Man She'ein Beis HaMikdash Kayim, they would bring it to a Beis HaKnesses. So indeed, again, now, Shma Mina. So, sometimes when you have Shma Mino, it sounds like that's final. We will see, thank God, Nach Emer Hashem. Today, this is not final. Okay. It's kind of amazing. Don't think that there was a time that the Jews in Bavel thought that those who live in Eretz Yisrael are taking the lulav after the Churban of the temple when Shabbos falls out on the first day. Like, did they not know that they didn't? Or maybe there were certain pockets of people that did. We'll see. Okay. Now, continues the Gemara. All of the above, what we learned today, was predicated on the following principle, that taking the lulav on the first day is a biblical obligation even outside the temple, which is why it makes it a more important mitzvah. Where do we know that from? Where do we know that from? So the Isyei min ha'toira b'gvulin min alei. What is the source for that? Maybe the mitzvah is only biblically to take the lulav in the temple, even on the first day. The Tanya. And this braisa is based on the verse in the portion of Emor, and we learned part of it above already. First of all, the pasuk begins ulokachtem. Ulokachtem is in the plural. You shall take in the plural. In the singular, the verse would have written vilokachta. If the Torah would have written it in the singular, one might have understood it to mean there's a mitzvah incumbent upon the court to do the mitzvah on behalf of all. And we have such mitzvahs. So, ulokachtem, it's in the plural. Everyone has to take it. Next word is ulokachtem lochem. What's the lochem? You already said in the plural, you should take it, everyone should take it. So the lochem is extra, from which we learned it has to belong to you. Meaning, not only may it not be stolen, which again, you might not even need a verse, because then it would be a mitzvah ba'aveda. Mishalachem, yours means you may not fulfill your obligation even with a borrowed lulav, and not with a stolen lulav. Next word, bayoim. Now the Torah could have written, ulokachtem, lochem, barishoin. Ulokachtem, lochem, barishoin. What's the bayoim? Bayoim, even on Shabbos. Now guys, obviously this will have to be explained. Because why would one think, midairaisa, that you wouldn't take it on Shabbos, for God to have to write an extra word to tell you every day, even on Shabbos? That's something we're going to address in a few lines from now. So let's hold that open. Then the next word is rishoin. Now it says bayoim harishoin. But we're going to break down and first learn the pshat of rishoin. Rishoin means even bigvulin, even outside the temple, everywhere on the first day must the lulav be taken. Now the Torah adds the letter Hey, Harishain, and as Tosfos points out, interestingly, sometimes a Hey includes, sometimes the extra letter excludes. It's all about the context of the verse. Here, our Braisa is understanding the extra letter Hey to be exclusionary. Harishain, Melamed, She'einu doicha elu yom tov harishain bilvad. That this power that we have, mamash, it's amazing, from the word Rishon, from the word Bayoim, that it even overrides Shabbos, that's only on the first day. Only on the first day does it override Shabbos. Now guys, obviously this verse cannot be referring to the Rabbah's decree, because the Torah is not going to be alluding to something that's only from rabbinic origin. So now we finished the Braisa, and the Gemara is going to have to explain, what's the Bayoim even on Shabbos, and what's the Hey only on the first day? What are we talking about? Omar Mar, the master, the Tana said Bayoim even on Shabbos. Why would God have to say even on Shabbos? Why would you think otherwise? Now we know the answer. The answer is, as we learned at the end of the shiur yesterday, right, that after the sages enacted this entire rabbinic muktzah issue, which is a rabbinic issue, one would argue that the 4 species are not considered a halachic utensil. Right? That's what we read in the last Tosfos on the Amid. It's not a keli. We can argue that. In the worst case scenario, the 4 species has a muktzah problem, which is only a rabbinic problem. But on a biblical level, there isn't a muktzah problem. So asks the Gemara, Michti, behold, the whole issue might be tiltal ba'almahu. So that's not a biblical issue. God doesn't have to write a word to address something that's not a biblical source. So the Gemara says, and so Itzrech, that's part of the question, La Mishnah, tiltul, doesn't make sense. So Amarava loyloi. Nitzrecha, the verse is needed, the Bayoim is needed, Ela l'machshirei Lulav. How great is this? So machshirei Lulav means preliminaries of a mitzvah. Now the sugya of preliminaries, the source of it, the ground zero of it is in Masechta Shabbos, Perek Rabbi Eliezer de Milah. Right, and we have this over there. We learned already. It's not only about bris milah. So we know from God that bayoim, that bayoim hashmini, that a bris milah is done even b'Shabbos. Fine. What about if some genius did not prepare the knife to do the bris? Making a utensil is a biblical violation. If you don't have a knife, can you make the knife on Shabbos? So we had that was the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and everyone else. Rabbi Eliezer subscribes to the opinion that once God revealed that a mitzvah overrides the Shabbos, even its preliminaries, even though they could have been done before, but they were not, it also overrides the Shabbos. Same thing is going to be over here. God told us you take a lulav. You don't even need, there's no issue biblically why you would not be allowed to take the lulav and to wave the lulav. But what happens if some chacham did not even cut the lulav off the tree? Now, cutting something off the ground is a biblical violation of chaytzed, of harvesting. Or if someone, let's go with Rabbi Yehuda, and if you would say that you have to bind it with knots, someone didn't make a knot, a real knot, kosher. What happens if there is a need not to do the mitzvah, to do the preliminaries of the mitzvah? So this verse is needed to teach you that you can even do the preliminaries on Shabbos. So obviously this Braisa won't be everyone's opinion. This Braisa will be the Shita, the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, as Va'aliba the Haitana. The Tanya, Lulav, V'chol Machshirav, Doichenes HaShabbos, Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. And now where does he get that from? Maybe the Machshirim should not be Doiches Shabbos. So that's the answer. My Talmud Rabbi Eliezer, that's this Tana. Because since the Torah writes the words Bayoim, which is extra, it could have said, Ulokachtem lochem barishain. What's the Bayoim? Even you can cut the lulav off the tree even on Shabbos. Beautiful. Now, the Rabbanan disagree with that. It's not that they don't need a verse. The Rabbanan hold that if you did not cut the lulav off the tree, you may not do so. Bachlal machshirim are not doiche. So what do they learn from the extra word bayoim? So the Gemara says, that is their source, that the mitzvah of lulav is only by day and not by night. The obligation of Lulav is not by night. Now what about the Rabbi Eliezer? He also agrees to that. Where does he know it from? He says the Gemara, Nafkalei, Rabbi Eliezer will learn it from the ending, from the latter part of the verse. What's the latter part of this verse? It says, Usamachtem, you shall rejoice. Lifnei Hashem Elokeichem, in front of Hashem Elokeichem. Shivas Yamim. And as we know that this Usmachtem, this rejoicement is not referring to the general joy of Yom Tov, but yes, it's specifically referring to the joy that you get from the mitzvah of Lulav. And yes, Lifnei Hashem, in the temple in front of God, the biblical obligation is all 7 days. And here the verse concludes with the words days. Days comes to tell you days and not nights. Okay. So once we see that in the temple it's days and not nights, so we understand that everywhere, whenever there is a mitzvah, it's only during the day and not during the night. Now, that's great. Why couldn't the sages also learn it from this Yamim? Why did they need the Bayom? So the Chachamim would tell you, V'Rabbanan ima Hasam, if we would only have the words Yamim and not the word Bayom, then I would have thought, Havamina, Leilef Yamim Misukah. We would have made a comparison to the same word Yamim that's used regarding the mitzvah of dwelling in a sukkah, and what would we have erroneously said? That Malahalan, just like by Sukah, we know Yamim, the mitzvah of dwelling in the sukkah, is dafka by day and by night. Yamim va'afilu leilos. Afkan, we would have said that when it comes to the lulav, Yamim va'afilu leilos. Right? So therefore, the Rabbanan needed to have an extra bayoim. Now what about Rabbi Eliezer? So just to speak out what the Rishonim say, Rabbi Eliezer said we don't say that. We would never say that. And why not? We would not compare it to a sukkah, because it goes without saying that the mitzvah of dwelling in the sukkah is not a one moment mitzvah. Dwelling means just that. You're living, you're dwelling. Dwelling by default means day and night. The mitzvah of taking the lulav is fulfilled in one moment, as we'll see soon in the Gemara. And even though, again, we learned 2 days ago at the end of Daf Mem Aleph Amid Beis that the minhagan shel anshe Yerushalayim was to walk around with the lulav the whole day, that's nice. That's beyond the letter of the law. By the letter of the law, the moment you took it, you fulfilled your obligation. It makes a lot more sense to say that if a mitzvah is done with a one moment action, it's not day and night. And therefore, Rabbi Eliezer would not have said so. The Chachamim, however, do say so, and the Gemara is going to go in the back and forth in a moment. And Bekitzer, that's why, according to the Rabbanan, you need to have the Bayoim dafka by day and not by night. According to Rabbi Eliezer, Bayoim is to teach you that even the preliminaries, if it was not done prior to Shabbos, even though it could have been done prior to Shabbos, it does override the Shabbos as well. Now, you know, the question was, would we have compared it to Sukah? How do you know that Sukah is day and night? The Sukah gufa minalan, the Tanach Rabbanan. Here we have the Braisa. When it says, Bas Sukkos Teishvu Shivas Yamim, says the Braisa, Yamim means Yamim Vafilu Leilos, which is how we paskin. The Braisa, Ato Omer Yamim Vafilu Leilos, Oy Eino Elo Yamim Veloy Leilos. Maybe not. Maybe Sukkah is only the mitzvah to dwell during the day. So and to make the question stronger, the Braisa is asking Vidinu. It's logical to say so. How is it logical? Because Ne'emar Kan, it says here in the portion of Sukah the words Yamim, the word Yamim. Okay, Basukah Teishu Shivas Yamim. And the Ne'emar Belulav, now we're going in the opposite direction. It says Yamim, that's again the Seifa, the end of the verse, right? That Usamachtem Lifnei Hashem Elokeichem Shivas Yamim. And Ma'alahalan, we know that Lulav is only by day and not by night. So why don't now we go in the opposite direction? Now that we know that Lulav is only by day and not by night, maybe we should learn Yechap Yamim Yamim, that Sukkah is also only by day and not by night. So that's one logic. But there's another logic, or perhaps go in the opposite direction. Nemar kan Yamim, it says by Sukkah the word Yamim, correct. Let's go the same Yamim. It says by the Miluyim. What's the Miluyim? That when Aaron and the sons were being inaugurated in the 7 days of inauguration, prior to them, Vayhi Bayom Hashmini, so one of the things that happened is that they remained in the temple for a full 7 days. And when they remained in the temple the full 7 days, they didn't go home at night. There it was day and night. So by the Meluim it says Yamim, and just like over there we know that they stayed there. They stayed in the Azarim for days and even nights. Afkan Yamim Vafilu Leilos. So l'chayra again, we would compare Yamim to the Meluyim. So now we don't know what to compare it to more. So says the Braisa, well, if we have two options, let's first use logic to see what is it more compatible with. Nida lemidoima. No, it's Sukah either from Lulav, Sukah either from the Meluyim. Danen davish mitzvasi kol hayom makes more sense to take the student here is Sukah. We're looking for the right teacher. So Sukah, right? The mitzvah is. Like we mentioned, it's not a one-time moment. You got to dwell, you got to live, eat, drink, sleep from something that the mitzvah is the entire day. What is that? The Meluyim. The Meluyim, in other words, they needed to remain in the temple for the whole time. That was the pshat of the Meluyim. And don't compare Sukah from Lulav. Lulav should not be the teacher, like Vitaka mentioned, Rabbi Eliezer, because Lulav is a one-time action. Right, it says, V'lokachtem. V'lokachtem means take it. If you took it, you did it. So l'chayr we're good. Says the Braisa, not so quick. Because if I want to use logic, I could argue the opposite direction. Right, second to last line. That maybe danin davar shemitzvasi l'doiros. Right, Sukah is the student. You're looking for a teacher. So the student is something that it's mitzvah. It was never a one-time thing. Every single year we have the obligation to dwell in a Sukah. Last line in the Amid. And maybe it's more compatible to the teacher, which is the Lulav. Midavar shemitzvasi l'doiros. Lulav, every year we have an obligation to take the Lulav. And and maybe don't learn it from the Meluyim. True, there they were sort of say quarantined, or they were in there for 7 days and 7 nights, but that was only a one-time thing. So I would not know what to compare it to. So the last line in the Amid, therefore, Talmud, Loimer, Daf, Mem, Gimel, Amid, Beis, Teishvu, forget about the Yomim. Teishvu, l'gzeira shava. What's the Teishvu? The Gemara says that Nemar Kan by Sukkot says the words Teishvu, dwell. By the Meluyim, it says, right, like Rashi quoted the pasuk, Upesach oyel moyed. Here we have Teishvu shivas yamim. So it's more pashut from the words. There are more links to the Meluyim. So indeed, Malahalon yamim vafilu leilois afkan by Sukah yamim vafilu leilois. So what we have at the end is that everyone is in consent. Everyone agrees. The only question is what the word bayom is used for. Everyone agrees that Sukah means to dwell day and night. Everyone agrees that the mitzvah of Lulav is only to be taken during the day. Everyone agrees that in the holy temple, the mitzvah of Lulav is to be taken the whole week. Outside the temple, biblically, the mitzvah of taking Lulav is only on the first day. And where we still are up to is that since on the first day, both in the temple and out of the temple, there's a mitzvah to take the Lulav. So for people who know when Rosh Chodesh is with certainty, which are for the people that dwell in the Holy Land, B'nai Eretz Yisrael, that indeed, for them there is no Gzeira Darabah. But that's where we are up to right now. Now, the next word in the Mishnah, right, was Lulav and Arava. And the mitzvah of Arava is 7 days. However, or 6 days, as we spoke on in the Mishnah, that there also, when Shabbos falls out on Sukkot, on that day in the temple, the Arava was not taken, with one exception, and that is, if the 7th day of Sukkot coincides with Shabbos, then the mitzvah of Arava is done nonetheless. Now guys, what we have now is what we call a minig of Nevi'im as a zecher lemigdash. And that is that after Hallel, during the 6 days of Sukkot, not on Shabbos, we're going to walk around the bima only holding the Daled Minim, right? Saying what we call the Hoishanas, and then on the day of Hoshana Rabbah, on the 7th day of Sukkot, right, not only will we walk around 7 times around the bima holding a lulav and the other minim, but at the end of it, we're going to take a bundle of 5 aravos, al pi Kabbalah, and knock it on the ground, hamtakas, hagvuras, etc. Now, what's important to know is that even though nowadays what we do is called the minig already from the Nevi'im, which means a very old ancient custom, but in the times of the temple, taking a arava in the temple by the kohanim is a biblical mitzvah, even though it's not written so in the Torah. Okay, so arava bashvi my tamadach yeshabes. Let's go back to what we learned above. We began this whole sugya introducing the decree of Rabbah, the Gzeira de Rabbah, that a person might go to an expert and might end up figuring out how to do the mitzvah better. And that is the reason why, even though biblically there's a mitzvah to take the Arava all of the 7 days in the temple, but when Shabbos falls out on any day other than on the 7th day, it's not done so. But, Gzeira D'Rabba, why don't we say Gzeira D'Rabba even on the 7th day? And let's go more. What did we learn today? That when the mitzvah is in the temple and outside the temple, which is the mitzvah of Lulav, even big Vulin, then we don't apply Gzeira D'Rabba. Okay, let's use that logic right now. Never is Arava taken biblically outside the temple. Never. So it doesn't have that power of Lulav. It should be like Lulav during the other 6 days, in which Gzeira D'Rabba trumps the mitzvah of Lulav in the temple. So even on the 7th day, this decree of Rabbah should have told us not to take the Arava in the temple. Gewaldig, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, interesting response, that since people don't even know that in the temple there is a biblical obligation of taking this Arava, so Kedei Lefarsima, in order to publicize Shehi Min HaTorah, that it is Min HaTorah, like Rashi writes 4 lines from the top of the Amid, Lefi she'eino meforeshes Min HaTorah behedya. It doesn't say so in the Torah. So therefore, Shafku la rafcha lemitcha Shabbos chad yom. They decided that 1 day of the 7 days, let it even override Shabbos. And no one is violating the Shabbos. But let us show that this is that important that Gzeira D'Rabba cannot stop it. That will remind everyone that it's that important. It's a biblical obligation. So hold on, asks the Gemara, Iyachi Lulav nami nitcha, on all of the 7 days in the temple, Kedei lefarsima shehu min HaTorah. This is important. And guys, don't think it's so clear, it's so evident that taking the Lulav in the temple for all 7 days is biblical. It's not that evident. What is evident, what is explicit is V'lokachtem lochem bayoim harishon. Good. When it says at the end of the verse that you shall rejoice in front of Hashem Elokeichem for 7 days, how do you know that that rejoicement refers to taking of the Lulav? Actually, normally rejoicement means ein simcha ela b'basar u'b'yayin, etc. It's a very generic statement to be joyful. Usamachtem simchas achag. That here in this verse, rejoicement means rejoicing specifically through the mitzvah of Lulav is also not explicit. Adarabah. So the Gemara says, well, it's not enough that it's min HaTorah. Lulav Gzeira Mishum Rabbah. We have to counter it. There's a fear people might end up carrying it. It's not enough Kedei Lefarsam min HaTorah. Well, if that's not enough, so Hadra Kasha L'Duchta. We're back to the question. So here we go. So we reject the fact that just because it's not clear that it's biblical, because it's not written so explicitly, that does not justify for it to trump the Rabbah's decree. So the answer is, that Arava, exactly who does the Arava? You know how it worked? First of all, it wasn't on all the Jewish people. It was only on the Kohanim. And not only that, the Kohanim did not even have the responsibility to bring it into the temple complex. You had designated shluchim of Beis Din that they brought those long, tall Aravis into the temple complex. So in other words, the obligation was upon people on a much smaller group of people that were a lot more learned, in which the fear of them inadvertently carrying is much less. Arava, since shluchei Beis Din maisnulam, that's why there's a fear. I'm sorry, that's why there is a lesser of a fear. And that's why at least when the 7th day falls out on Shabbos or Shabbos on the 7th day, it's taken in the temple. But Lulav, since Lakoil Masud, everyone is obligated to take the Lulav, so the chances of someone b'shoige carrying it, going to the expert is much greater. Well, now we're back to the problem. The problem is that indeed, why would we not say that the Arava is always taken for all of the 7 days in the temple, even if Shabbos is not on the 7th day, if it's 6th, 5th, 4th, etc., because at the end of the day, Shluchei Beis Din bring it. They're not going to forget. Answers the Gemara, theoretically you're right. But if Arava will always be taken for 7 days, and Lulav is not, Lulav even in the temple, even during the times of the temple, in the temple, was not taken on Shabbos other than when Shabbos falls on the first day. So it's going to give the appearance that Arava is more important than Lulav. So people are going to disrespect, they're going to disparage the mitzvah of Lulav. Asi lifakfuke belulav. So the Gemara says, I got it. Okay. So therefore we only will allow 1 day Shabbos for the mitzvah to override Shabbos, but why the seventh day? Why not do it consistently like with the Lulav? Answers the Gemara, that if only Shabbos first day, only then in temple you'll take the Arava, people are going to think that Arava is not a biblical obligation. And why are you doing it even on Shabbos? Because since anyways you're doing the Lulav, so it's piggybacking, so to say, off the Lulav. Amri, they're going to say that Lulav hu de kadachi. And in order to make it clear that Arava is by itself a biblical mitzvah, and therefore at least once one of the 7 days it overrides even the Shabbos, you pick another day. Well, another day doesn't mean the 7th day. Asks the Gemara, pick any one of the other 6 days. So the Gemara answers, Kiven the kamafkas lomirish, and since you don't allow the first day of Aravos to override the Shabbos when Shabbos falls out on the first day, again, for people not to think that it's really about the Lulav. So if you want to look at a holiday and you want to ask what's the most important day, the answer will be the first or the last, or the first and the last. They are the most important dates. And actually we see that by the fact that the prohibition of doing work is normally the first or the last. Okay, so you can't do it on the first, they do it on the last. The first and or the last are the most special days. And now we're having the same question we had on Amud Aleph, and that is, ha'idna means after the Churban, before the building of the third temple. Now that again we are taking it because of minig neviim. Now I know that nowadays everyone takes it, but Rashi expounds the question of the Gemara. Well, we could have said that whenever the 7th day falls on Shabbos, only shluchim of Beis Din should bring the Aravos, and only certain kohanim or other designated people, zecher lemigdash, should walk around the bima, etc. They could have made it more like the temple, and now also nami litre. We, after the Churban, prior to the third temple, if Hoshana Rabbah is on Shabbos, let's go through with our minig neviim of doing the Hoshanas. And the Gemara now begins to answer what we had on Amud Aleph, that you're right. If we would have been certain that today is the 7th day, we would have done it. But since Anan lo yadainan b'kviyusa de yarcha, we're not certain that it's taka the 7th day, that's why we can't do it. Well, says the Gemara, if that's the case, what about the people that live in Eretz Yisrael? Inu, the yadi b'kviyusa de yarcha. They only have 1 day Yom Tiv, they don't have 8 day Sukkahs, they have 7 day Sukkahs. The first day is Yom Tiv. So then, litchi, even in present day. So the Gemara says that question, unlike we said on Amud Aleph, here is a non-question. It's not that we have it, it's a non-question. You know why? Because Ki Asa Bar Hedya, when Bar Hedya came to Babel, he let us know, Amar, that Loi Ikla, that nowadays the 7th day of Sukkot never falls on Shabbos. You know, it's even before Hillel the Minor established the calendar that everyone is using until the coming of Mashiach, even when in Eretz Yisrael, after the Churban, they were still establishing the month in the ideal way by witnesses coming to the Beis Din, and by there being a declaration, they made sure. Tosfos goes into the details, either by adding a day in Elul, or if that wouldn't work out, by adding days in Av, by making sure that the 7th day of Sukkot will never fall on Shabbos. And okay, now Kiyasa Ravin, says the Gemara, Ravin challenges that. When Ravin came to Babel, and not only Ravin, but the Chol Nechoisei, all other Amoraim, great rabbis who would come down to Babel, they all said that it's not true, that there were times, this is again prior to our pre-established calendar, that in Eretz Yisrael, Iklei, the 7th day of Sukkot, fell on a Shabbos. It might have been very rare, but such a thing happened. And yet, even in Eretz Yisrael, the Minag Neviim Zecher Lemigdash was not Doiche Shabbos. It didn't override the Shabbos. And like here in Babel, we're not going to do a Shana Rabbah if it were to fall on Shabbos. So now we're back to the Kasha. The kasha is, why in Eretz Yisrael, where there's no doubt when the calendar is, when the first day of the month is, when the 15th day of the month is, at least to establish that in the Beis HaMikdash, taking the Arava is a biblical mitzvah. Why don't we establish the Zeich, even though nowadays it's only in the Beis HaMikdash, doesn't matter, Zeich HaMikdash. Why would we not do it in Israel? That's the kasha. So Omar Rabbi Yosef gives the following response. We keep on mentioning that there is a mitzvah to take an Arava in the Beis HaMikdash. Now we have this big debate, exactly what was the mitzvah. And you know why that's important? Because when we are doing something, Zecher LeMikdash, in remembrance of how things were done in the temple, if it's already this similar, if it's not the same, that will be the answer. Then it won't justify, you might end up carrying it. There is this fear that Rabbi introduced. So you have to balance it. But still it's important to make the Zecher, because in the temple it was of biblical origin. Once what we do is not the same, that's a reason for us to enact Rabbi's decree. Now, what would make our taking of the Arava now more similar or less similar? It's not about how we would take it, but it's about what was done in the temple. Guys, we do not have an altar. Now, if the mitzvah in the temple was to take it in your hand, now we can take it in our hands as well. Now the Zecher LeMikdash is more similar. But if in the Beis HaMikdash the mitzvah was not for them to take it in their hands, it was leaned against the altar from all sides. The Kohanim held in their hands Lulavim and they walked around the Mizbeach. That's fine. But that's not the real mitzvah. The mitzvah regarding the Arava was only leaning it against the altar. Yechap. According to that, so anyways it's not fully similar. Since it's not fully similar, we're not going to allow it to override the Shabbos. That will be our approach right now. Amar Rabbi Yosef, man leimelah. Who's telling you that the mitzvah in the temple of the Arava is to take it in their hand? If that would have been the case, then the Zecher LeMikdash would have been precise. Then your question would have been a question. But that's not the case. Dilma, perhaps the mitzvah in the temple was bizekifa. Skifa means to stand it. To stand these branches and having them lean around and over, it was that tall, over the Mizbeach. And like we mentioned, therefore, there isn't a real Zecher, and that's why even in Eretz Yisrael, if and when the seventh day falls out on Shabbos, they don't do it. Because even when you do it, it's not a real Zecher. We're not doing it the same way. And now we're going to have until the end of the Amid this back and forth. What is the mitzvah in the temple? Was it binatila? Was it to hold it in the hand? Or was it biskifa? Was it to lean it against? Was it to stand it against the altar? So Eisvei Abaya is going to continuously challenge Rav Yosef, who is his teacher, who is suggesting that in the temple the mitzvah of Arava is zikifa. It says in our Mishnah, Lulav va'Arava, it says it together. Either 6 days or 7 days. And l'chayda, by the Mishnah putting it together, my love, it taka means that Arava is like the Lulav. Meaning, ma Lulav, we know the mitzvah of Lulav is not to lean it. The mitzvah of Lulav is binatila. So Arava is also binatila. So Rav Yosef says, that's not a kasha, my idiom, me the idiom. Come on. Hakadei, this one is as this one is, and that one is as that one is. Hakadei hakadei. Abaya is not going to let up, and Abaya will succeed. Next challenge Abaya the student has against this teacher. Eisvei Abaya, it says in a Mishnah, guys, we're going to have this Mishnah in 2 days on Daf Mem Hey. B'chol Yoim, every day in the Holy Temple, Makif and the Samizbeach, they would walk around. They would encircle. They were Makif, they made a Hekif around the Mizbeach one time. Taka nowadays, Minag Levium, nowadays, how many times do we walk around the Bima? When we say Hoshainas, we walk around once. But in the temple, that day, meaning the 7th day of Sukah, is Hoshana Rabbah, Sheva Pa'amim. Now, the Mishnah says, Makifin, they walked around, and my love ba'arava. Is it not that they walked around holding the Arava? And that would mean that the mitzvah is Netila. So the Gemara says no, Rav Yosef says no, they walked around holding the Lulav. They didn't walk around holding the Arava. Says Abaya, yeah, but Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Abba Baravua, Ba'arava. Now here's funny, because here he's not proving from a Tana against Rav Yosef. He's quoting another Amayra. That's not a problem. So Amalei Rav Yosef says, well, listen, I have the right to disagree with him. Hu Amalach Ba'arava, but I disagree. Va'ano Amino. Rav Yosef holds that the meaning of the Mishnah is they walked around with the Lulav. Guys, it's important to know that nowadays we taka walk around the Bima Dafka with the Lulav. We don't walk around holding the Hoishanas. And now the Gemara just wants to tell you that this was really a debate between many Amoraim. Itmer, we learned, Rabbi Elazar, the Amoira, says that they walked around, they circled the Mizbeach, only holding the Lulav. Like Rav Yosef. Yeah, the Arava was there, but the Arava was prior to the ceremony leaned against the altar, but it stood on the ground, leaning over. Rav Shmuel Bar Nosson says in the name of Rab Chanina, like Abaya. No, they walked around holding the Arava. And v'chein Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rabba Bar Avua. They walked around holding the Arava. And Amalei Rava Rabbi Yitzchak Berei the Rabba Bar Chana. He calls him son of Torah because Rabbi Yitzchak's father was Rabba Bar Chana, who's called the Torah. So son of Uriah, you son of the Torah, Ta. Va'emalach, come and let me tell you, Milsa Ma'alisa, some amazing statement. Ahava Amar Avuch, that your father shared with me. What did your father share with me? That that which it says in the Mishnah on page 45. That that every day the Kohanim would circle the altar once. And on the day of what we call Lishana Ram, on the 7th day of Sukah, I want you to know, Hachi Amar Avuch, your father quoted Rabbi Elazar that he did it with a lulav exactly like Rabbi Yosef. So far Rabbi Yosef is good. And all that answers our question. Because the moment you understand that in the temple, the Arava was done only by Zekifa, which means that the Zecher L'Migdash is inaccurate, that justifies why it won't override Shabbos even in the Holy Land. But let's go weiter. Abaya is going to still challenge his teacher Rav Yosef. Esvei, it says in another brayso, Lulav doiches haShabbos b'tchilasoi, and the Arava overrides Shabbos b'soifoi, as we had in our Mishnah. Says further the brayso, Pamachas, there was a time that Chal Shviya Shal Arava Liyos b'Shabbos, that the 7th day fell on Shabbos. And like we mentioned in the beginning of the Sugya, that it does not say explicitly in the Torah that in the temple there is a biblical obligation to take this Arava. There is no Arava ceremony mentioned in the Torah. So this is part of what we call the oral Torah. Well, during the times where we had this break-off, right, the Talmidim of Antignoish is Soichai. So you had Tzadok and Baisus. And they were the ones that at that time, what they said was that they accept the written, but they reject the oral. So Vehiviu, they brought Muribiyos or Murbiyos Shal Arava. They brought shoots of an Arava from Erev Shabbos, as you should, because they would take it on the 7th day. V'nichom ba'azara, as we learned in our Mishnah, that if the 7th day of Sukkot falls on Shabbos, you do the ceremony. But v'hikiru behem baisusim, the students of Baisus, who completely rejected the biblical Arava obligation, they wanted to stop that from happening. So what did they do? Unatalum, they took those pre-prepared aravais, uchevashum, and they hid them under stones. Why did they hide them under stones? Guys, these aravas were humongous. It wasn't that they were out of sight, but being that there were stones over them, and stones are muktzah, so there's no way of you getting to it. Oh. What happened? Lamachar, the next day, it's people that were not that learned noticed what happened. They did not know that muktzah has to be honored. They thought that it overrides muktzah. So from their ignorance, ushematum, they extracted these pre-prepared aravas from under the stones. They already did that. Bishoygeg. And they brought them to the Kehanim. And the Kehanim did the mitzvah. Uzekafum, and they stood them up, leaning over the sides of the altar. Why did the Baisusim hide it? Here's the key words: Lafi she'ein Baisusim moedim shechibut arava doiches haShabbos. Chibut, guys, the word chibut means waving. Waving is connected to taking. If there's a mitzvah only of zekifa, there would be no mitzvah of waving. The Baisusim did not accept the oral Torah that there is a mitzvah of waving. Clearly, Alma says Abaya that benetilahi, and indeed this refutes. It refutes Rav Yosef. It refutes all the other Amoraim. The mitzvah was to wave it. Now we're back to the problem. So let it override the Shabbos, since it's a biblical obligation. Which is the reason why Bisman Beis HaMikdash Kaim, even when the 7th day fell on Shabbos, on the 7th day you took it. Why not now, Zeichel HaMikdash, why not take it? And the only answer is because we in Bavel, we don't know when the 7th day is. Now we're going back to what we learned in Amud Aleph. So since we in Bavel will not take it, if the 7th day is Shabbos, because we don't even know for sure if it's the 7th day, We are rejecting what we said earlier on, but in Israel they take it. We don't want to have different communities of Jews celebrating God's mitzvahs in different ways. That's really one of the meanings of the verse that we just read last week. I think it was in Parshas Re'ei, Loisis Goidedu. The literal meaning is that when people lose one of their relatives, they should not express or externalize their pain, their mourning, by scratching and cutting out pieces of their flesh. We believe in externalizing pain, but we rent our garments, not our flesh. But Chazal say, Loisis Goidedu means don't make yourselves into groups. Don't make yourselves into agudois. Kiven da anan loidochinon, inu nami loidochu. Didn't we say it today, that that Lulav is not taken on Shabbos, even on the first day in Bavel? But didn't we say above, but ulididu dachi? Daf mem dalet. So the Gemara rejects it. No. So the Gemara says, Amri, that lididu nami loidachi, that even in Eretz Yisrael, after the Churban, prior to the building of the third temple, even in Israel, you don't take the Lulav when Sukkot falls out on Shabbos, even if it is on the first day of Sukkot. And the first day of Sukkot is more important than all the other days, like we learned. V'haraya, the mitzvah is to take it both in the temple and outside the temple, both by Midrash and by Gvulin. Nevertheless, look inside the top Rashi, Shaloi lasis Yisrael agudais, and if every group will do something different, v'nira kishtei toiros, it would look like we have two different toiros. They done for us in Bavel, loidachi lulav Shabbos, so to make everything uniform, that's the way we paskin. No one takes the lulav on Shabbos, even on the first day, even in Israel. And similarly, no one will do the minag hanavim, what we call the hoishanas, even if the seventh day of Sukkot would have fallen on Shabbos. It doesn't trump Shabbos, all because of Gzeira D'Rabba. I just want to conclude by sharing a gavaldik vart that, when you have a word in the Torah that has different meanings, the Rebbe was very much into explaining how all of these interpretations have to have a connection between one and the other. The literal meaning of lois is going to do, like we mentioned, is that don't scratch out pieces of flesh in mourning of. And Chazal said lois is going to do means, the word doesn't mean scratching out, but it means don't make yourself into different groups. What's the connection between one and the other? There's a beautiful connection. And that is that since we know that all of the Jewish people are considered one koima, one spiritual body, making Jews into different groups that have very different practices is exactly what scratching out, what cutting out a piece of flesh is one body, leave it intact. Don't hurt your body. Don't take your body apart. Don't change it from the way God made it. The Jewish people are one group, and part of our expression of our belief that we are one, mamish one, is by keeping our practice the same. Again, of course, there are some areas where we do have the way the Ramah paskins, the way the Mechaber paskins, but there is a limit to that. If it's going to come to whether you actually do the mitzvah or not, we don't allow for Israel and outside Israel to have two completely different practices, God willing, to be continued.